Chapter 1. The Oregon Box. In 2021, Emily Watson, a 31-year-old illustrator from San Francisco, received a formal notice from a probate attorney's office in Portland. Her aunt, Sarah Hadley, had died 3 weeks earlier in a hospice outside Eugene. The news came as a jolt. Emily hadn't spoken to Sarah in nearly a decade, though the memory of her aunt lingered like a shadow cast across every family gathering. Sarah had been the unspoken warning in their lineage, a woman gradually pushed to the margins, first with concerned glances, then with silence. The letter included a single unexpected detail. Sarah had left her entire estate, namely an old Victorian house in Astoria, Oregon, to Emily. The house had been shuttered for 5 years. Locals claimed the windows were always dark, the porch sagging under the weight of moss and time. No one had entered since Sarah stopped speaking to the family and disappeared from view. Emily remembered that house only through the distorted lens of childhood: a sunlit kitchen with blue curtains, a tall hallway mirror that made her look elongated and ghostly, the scent of something herbal and sharp that clung to the furniture. But most of all, she remembered the warmth. Sarah had been the first to show her how to sketch flower petals with a soft pencil, the first to praise her drawings without critique. Emily remembered sitting on the back steps with a juice box while Sarah smoked a cigarette and stared out at the river. That version of her aunt had vanished long ago. She drove north in early October, when the roads twisted through damp forests and the coastline was buried in fog. The town of Astoria greeted her with closed shops, salt-damp sidewalks, and gulls shrieking above telephone wires. The house sat near the edge of town, obscured by overgrown hedges and rusted gates. It looked even older than she remembered, the paint chipped, the shutters hanging like injured limbs. She unlocked the door with a key mailed separately by the attorney, half expecting resistance. But the door opened with an exhausted sigh, as though relieved to finally be noticed. Inside, dust had reclaimed everything. Furniture stood beneath gauzy sheets, wallpaper peeled in thin curls. The air smelled of mildew, cedar, and the faint metallic scent of forgotten things. The silence was complete, thick and unwelcoming. Somewhere upstairs, the floorboards shifted, although no one else was present. Emily left her bags by the door and began walking through each room slowly, as if retracing something that had once belonged to her but had since become foreign. In the study, hidden behind stacks of old botanical books and dry ink bottles, she found a familiar object: a small wooden music box, carved with sunflowers and worn at the corners. It had belonged to Sarah and, long ago, to Emily during her stays. Emily had assumed it was lost. Now it sat quietly on a low shelf, as though waiting. She picked it up with reverence and turned the winding key. The melody staggered, broken from years of silence, then fell into a faint, uneven tune. Something inside the box rattled. Beneath the velvet lining, folded tightly, was a pale blue envelope. No name on the front. Inside, a note written in fine, deliberate penmanship. The ink had bled slightly with age, but the words were unmistakable. "Start in the north room and trust none of them." Emily read the sentence twice. Then she folded the paper back along its creases and returned it to the envelope. She stared into the quiet room. Outside, the wind picked up, scraping branches against the house like fingernails across a locked door. Chapter 2. The North Room. The North Room was smaller than she remembered, almost square, with a single window facing the forest. The walls were stripped of any wallpaper, revealing raw plaster and nail holes like old scars. The wooden floor was scuffed and dry, with knots darkened by age and dampness. Dust lay thick across every surface, catching in the slanted afternoon light. The ceiling bore faint water stains in the corners, and a single bulb hung from a frayed cord in the center, unlit and swaying slightly with each creak of the house. Nothing in the room looked touched in years, except the corner near the window. There, half covered by a moth-eaten blanket, stood an old film projector on a low table, beside a wooden crate packed with reels. The crate was marked with tape and faded pen. Family Archives, 1986. Emily paused before touching it. The air felt heavier here, not colder, just more saturated, like the room had stored too much memory and now exhaled it. She crouched down and lifted the lid of the crate. Inside, nestled among crumpled newspaper and brittle labels, were 5 film reels, each labeled in Sarah's neat script. One read, Thanksgiving 1986. Another said simply, Backyard. Emily selected the one marked with the holiday, dusted it off, and carried it to the projector. The power cord barely reached the outlet by the door. It took 2 attempts for the plug to catch. The projector buzzed, coughed, then came alive with a trembling whir. Emily found a portable screen folded behind a cabinet and propped it up against the bare wall. When the film began, the image came into focus slowly, grainy and soft-edged, with colors faded into autumnal tones. It was a dining room she faintly recognized from the old house in Eugene, where her grandparents had once hosted family holidays. The camera panned across a long table set with heavy china and tall candles. Laughter murmured in the background. There was Grandma June, her hair in a tight bun, passing a bowl of stuffing. Beside her sat Grandpa Harold, his face ruddy from wine, his hands gesturing as he told some story. Emily's father, much younger, wore a loose tie and looked thinner than she had ever seen him. Her mother, barely 25, had her hair in waves and smiled too often, too wide. Then Sarah appeared. She was seated at the end of the table, apart from the central conversations. She looked older than the others despite being the youngest adult there. Her shoulders hunched slightly. Her eyes didn't track the voices in the room. Her face was pale and closed, as if she were present physically, but absent in every other sense. No one addressed her. No one poured her wine. Emily watched as June leaned toward Harold, her mouth barely moving. She said something Emily couldn't hear, but her eyes flicked to Sarah, and then her hand made a sharp, dismissive motion in the air. Harold nodded and reached for his glass. The camera shifted slightly, as if the person holding it had adjusted their grip. A voice came from off-screen, male, low, casual. Don't let her ruin it. The film continued with scenes of toasts, a candle being relit, silverware clinking. Emily watched it once, then rewound. In the second viewing, she caught the smallest details. At the far end of the table, under the chair, a toddler sat cross-legged on the floor, playing quietly with wooden blocks. A little girl. Her, most likely. The child reached up once, tugging gently at Sarah's sleeve. Sarah looked down, smiled softly, and brushed the child's hair back. In that moment, Emily's father, standing with a wineglass beside the buffet, glanced directly at the camera. His face stilled, expression unreadable. His eyes locked on the lens for several seconds. Not like someone being filmed, but like someone recognizing the weight of the moment, like someone who knew that the recording would outlive them. The projector buzzed softly. The reel ticked toward its end. Emily sat motionless in the half-lit room, her own shadow flickering over the screen. The walls felt closer now, as if the house were leaning in. She didn't move to shut off the machine. Not yet. Something inside her had shifted, and the silence around her wasn't empty anymore. It was watching. Chapter 3. Room of Mirrors. The cupboard beneath the stairs had gone unnoticed for days. It blended into the shadows, tucked between the coat rack and the baseboards, painted the same dull gray as the surrounding wall. There was no knob, only a small keyhole with rust around its edges. Emily had walked past it half a dozen times before something about its symmetry caught her attention. On the morning of the third day, with autumn light angling through the stairwell window, she crouched beside it and tried the brass key she had found inside the music box. The lock turned with a dry click. The door opened inward, revealing a narrow passage that sloped slightly downward. Dust stirred at her feet as she stepped inside, flashlight beam catching on uneven walls and cobwebs. The corridor ended in another door, thin, with a warped wooden frame, but unlocked. It opened with resistance, revealing a room unlike any other in the house. The walls were entirely covered in mirrors. Every surface reflected back fractured versions of her face and body, stretched, compressed, repeated endlessly. Mirrors lined the ceiling, angled slightly downward, and even the floor was made of polished panels, some cracked with age. The effect was disorienting. Emily stood in the center, her breath shallow, surrounded by distorted versions of herself from every direction. It felt like being observed by 100 quiet witnesses. In the far corner of the room stood a small vanity table. Its paint had flaked off in patches, revealing the wood beneath, and its drawer was slightly ajar. On top sat a thick album bound in soft, worn leather. She approached slowly, watching her movement echo and scatter in every direction. The album's cover bore no title, only a single pressed daisy beneath the plastic sleeve. Inside were pages filled with clippings and photographs. Some were taped in, others pinned with yellowed brass fasteners. Newspaper articles detailed family events, weddings, real estate purchases, charitable fundraisers. Every piece had underlines and margin notes written in Sarah's familiar slanted hand. Across photos of family dinners, christenings, and backyard barbecues, she had scrawled phrases in red ink on the backs of the prints. He lied. She knew. They all signed. The handwriting grew angrier, more chaotic, as the album progressed. Emily flipped slowly, absorbing the unease with each turn. A grainy photograph of her Uncle Thomas in a lab coat had been labeled Architect of the Fraud. A note beneath it, written in a calmer hand, laid out dates and a document ID. Below that were two notarized forms, psychiatric evaluations dated March 1994, both bearing Sarah's name, and both signed by Thomas Hadley, MD. Attached by paperclip was a letter on clinic letterhead declaring Sarah unstable, paranoid, and incapable of managing her financial affairs. The diagnosis had resulted in a transfer of property, a parcel in Portland, along with a sizable life insurance fund, moved into a family-controlled trust. The next page showed a legal signature authorization form, dated just 1 week after the evaluations. Sarah's name was on the line, but the handwriting didn't match. Beside the album was a bundle of cassette tapes labeled in chronological order, each marked Recordings, Meetings, March-June 1994. Emily didn't touch them yet. She sat for a long time, the album open on her lap, surrounded by her multiplied reflection. Dozens of Emilys peering in from warped glass, all of them equally silent. This wasn't a breakdown. This was a campaign. Sarah hadn't invented conspiracies. She had lived inside one. The room didn't feel like a shrine or a secret hideaway. It felt like an archive built out of desperation. A map constructed in fragments, assembled by someone who knew she wouldn't be believed and kept going anyway. Emily closed the album, not because she was finished, but because she couldn't go further yet. The mirrors remained still around her, reflecting nothing but truths finally unearthed. Chapter 4. The Question Room. The attic revealed itself grudgingly. The hatch door, stiff with years of disuse, creaked open beneath Emily's grip, releasing a dry gust of insulation dust and the scent of old paper. A narrow staircase led up into shadow, the kind of space that swallowed noise and made the air feel heavier. She climbed slowly, one hand on the railing, the other clutching a flashlight whose beam bounced off exposed beams and tattered insulation. The attic floor was uneven, a patchwork of warped boards and discolored rugs, and every step sounded too loud. Along the far wall, beneath the angled pitch of the roof, stood a row of wooden crates and filing boxes. They were labeled not with names or categories, but with small blue stickers numbered in faded ink. One crate, marked with a question mark instead of a number, sat apart from the rest. Dust coated the lid. Emily knelt beside it and lifted the top. Inside were several composition notebooks with cracked spines, bound bundles of letters tied with twine, and manila envelopes thick with documents. At the very bottom lay a weathered leather folder marked K 1978. The sight of that single initial sent a ripple through her memory. She had heard the name only once, as a child. Catherine, her grandmother's younger sister, a woman who had vanished before Emily was born. The family story had always been brief and unsatisfying. Catherine had gone to Europe and chosen to stay. No forwarding address, no funeral, just silence. Emily opened the folder carefully. Inside were copies of police reports dated July 1978. Catherine Hadley, age 26, reported missing by her mother. Initial interviews suggested she had taken a train to New York with the intention of flying abroad. No evidence of foul play, no confirmed sightings. The case was closed within 6 months. The final page bore a red stamp, presumed voluntary departure. Tucked behind the reports was a hand-drawn map of the Hadley estate as it had looked in the 1970s, with annotations in Sarah's hand. Several arrows pointed to a disused well house on the far edge of the original property, long since demolished. Beneath the map, folded twice, was a letter from Sarah addressed to "My future reader." It began with a date, August 1983, and continued in tight, urgent script. Catherine didn't leave. She saw what our father was doing with the land transfers. She confronted him. She was going to expose everything. The next morning, she was gone. They said she left voluntarily, but I found her earring near the basement door, the one from Florence with the green stone. I showed it to Mother. She told me never to speak of it again. I kept the earring. Emily sat back and examined the bottom of the crate. Wedged into the corner beneath a stack of loose receipts was a small velvet pouch. Inside was a chipped green stone set in silver, the same earring she had seen worn in a faded black and white family portrait, the one Sarah kept hidden behind her mirror. Emily turned it over in her palm. The clasp was bent, as if it had been ripped from the ear. The rest of the box contained legal correspondence, letters from Sarah's attempts to reopen the case in the early 2000s, all denied due to insufficient evidence and lack of compelling new information. There were transcripts of phone calls with attorneys, notes in the margins detailing who had refused to help, and a growing list of names: city clerks, deputies, notaries. On a final page, written in pencil and underlined twice, Sarah had left a sentence that rang like a bell in the still attic air. "If no one believes me while I'm alive, they will believe her." Emily closed the box slowly, her hands trembling. This was no longer a matter of family tension or long-buried betrayal. It was a body erased, a voice silenced, a truth hidden in the bones of the house. Sarah hadn't just left her a building. She had left a puzzle made of real danger and the beginning of something deeper than memory or revenge. She looked around the attic, each shadow now sharper, more deliberate. The house didn't feel haunted. It felt burdened, weighted with all that had been concealed beneath its roof. Emily rose, holding the earring, the letter, and the map. There was no one left to ask. Only the house and what it still might yield. Chapter 5. The Room of Silence. The day arrived gray and windless. Emily had prepared the house in silence, her movements careful, deliberate, without hesitation. She had dusted nothing. The furniture remained where it had been left decades ago. What mattered now wasn't cleanliness or comfort. It was clarity. The weight of the evidence she had gathered over the past week pulsed through the house like electricity through wires hidden behind old walls. She had invited her family under the guise of finalizing estate paperwork. The tone of her emails had been neutral, businesslike, impossible to refuse without revealing unease. They came slowly, one by one. Her mother first, heels clicking on the porch like metronome ticks. Then her aunt and uncle, both wearing stiff coats and tight expressions. Finally, her younger brother arrived, eyes shifting, already unsettled by the drive into this forgotten corner of Oregon. She welcomed them with a nod, saying little, letting the silence expand around them like a fog. Each room had been curated for confrontation. In the dining room, on the wall where a painting had once hung, she had pinned a large printed ledger, It was framed with care and illuminated by a standing lamp. The document listed assets previously belonging to Sarah, properties, stocks, insurance policies. Next to each item was a column marked Current Custodian, and in that column, names reappeared: Hadley, Jensen, M. Watson. Illegible to the casual eye, but undeniable when read line by line. On the table beneath it sat notarized documents bearing transfer dates and signatures. Each signature had been forged. The pen strokes were nearly perfect, but not quite. In the study, she had set up an old monitor and DVD player, timed to loop a single video. The footage was grainy, captured by a camera hidden in the spine of a bookshelf. The scene was a private meeting. Sarah and the family lawyer, Richard Kincaid. His voice, low and cautious, could be heard advising her not to stir up the past and suggesting that certain arrangements were made for the family's stability. At one point, Sarah asked plainly if the psychiatric reports were forged. Kincaid hesitated, then nodded once, almost imperceptibly. The clip ended in silence, the screen turning black before repeating. The kitchen was brightly lit, almost domestic, but the images pinned to the cabinets were anything but. They were photographs of Catherine, dated and annotated, one taken in the front yard in 1978, another with a note that read, "Last known sighting, Sunday, June 11th. Below them, on the counter, sat a worn folder with the original police report, the red-stamped voluntary departure crossed out in pencil. On the refrigerator door was a printed family tree with Catherine's name outlined in red and circled twice. No one spoke when they entered the room. The hallway to the downstairs bathroom was lined with more photos. Sarah as a child, Sarah as a teenager, Sarah the day she was institutionalized. On the bathroom sink, neatly placed beneath a glass paperweight, was a letter. It had been written in 1994 by Emily's mother to her Uncle Thomas, short and clinical. In it, she confirmed that Sarah had not signed the property release form herself, and that she appreciated the efficiency of how the matter had been handled. At the bottom, a postscript: "The fewer people who know, the better." They moved through the house slowly, first skeptical, then defensive, then silent. Anger surfaced in waves, accusations of manipulation, claims of misunderstanding, protests about intentions and memory. But none of them dared touch the documents. Emily said nothing. She stayed at a distance, watching, her presence like a blade pressing into soft places. A small camera, discreetly installed in the corner of the living room, captured everything. When the last door closed and the car engines faded into the trees, Emily sat down in the quiet. She opened her laptop. The folder she had prepared was labeled Hadley Archive Complete. It contained scanned documents, transcripts, video files, and metadata logs. She uploaded it to a secure cloud drive. Then she composed an email. She sent it to 6 local journalists, 3 editors, 1 retired detective who had investigated cold cases involving elder fraud, and the district attorney's office of Clatsop County. When she was done, she closed the computer and stepped out onto the porch. The sky was beginning to turn. The house behind her creaked softly, settling not into silence, but into something else, resolution. She stood there for a long time, listening to the wind move through the trees, knowing that tomorrow would not belong to secrets anymore. Chapter 6. The House Where the Truth Remains. 2 weeks after the files were released, Emily received a formal summons. The hearing was scheduled in a small courthouse in downtown Astoria, attended by legal counsel, investigators, and a quiet contingent of press who had picked up the trail left by her encrypted archive. She entered alone, documents neatly packed, face calm. She no longer flinched at the sound of her family's names. The truth had already begun its work. One family member had submitted a sworn confession, detailing their role in the orchestration of Sarah's institutionalization and the falsified property transfers. Another had vanished, his phone disconnected, his law office shuttered, his name now a ghost in legal documents. A third had filed a civil suit for defamation, and emotional distress, which was quietly dismissed when the court verified the signatures in question were indeed fraudulent. Emily answered every question with precision. She cited dates, included names, cross-referenced Sarah's journals with public records. The judge, an older woman with a voice like frost, closed the file and asked if she intended to retain ownership of the estate. Emily replied that she had no intention of selling, but not for the reasons anyone expected. Within a month, the property was renamed. The deed was revised to reflect the new title, Equilibrium House. No longer the Hadley residence, no longer a private ruin shrouded in family whispers. It was reclassified as a historical preservation site with special provisions for public access. She began with the attic. The crates of journals were cataloged and placed in climate-controlled cases. The letters were scanned and tagged, each one assigned to a digital index. The police reports, affidavits, and legal transcripts were displayed in rotating exhibits. A reading room was established in what had once been the drawing room, its fireplace cleaned. The walls painted a soft gray. Donations arrived from local preservation groups and trauma researchers. Gradually, the space became more than a house. It became a place where silent stories could be held with care. The community responded with a quiet reverence. People came not out of curiosity, but out of recognition. Survivors of betrayal, children of buried truths, caretakers of impossible memories. Emily gave guided tours once a week, each one different. She never told the full story. She didn't need to. The days grew shorter. Rain returned. The house, once brittle and abandoned, settled into something softer. Vines that had once choked the outer wall were trimmed back. A small plaque was installed near the front steps. It read, "Here, memory is not erased. It is studied, protected, restored." On a Sunday afternoon in late November, Emily sat on the staircase with a mug of chamomile tea. The house was quiet, but not empty. Light from the west windows spilled across the floorboards. The scent of old paper mingled with lemon oil and pine. She reached into her satchel and removed the music box, the one that had first led her here. The latch was slightly loose from handling. She opened the lid. The melody sputtered and turned once more, broken and beautiful. Beneath the velvet liner, tucked where her fingers knew to look, was the cassette she had not yet played. Across its label, in Sarah's careful writing, was a single line. "This is a story about how love doesn't save us, but memory might." Emily held it in her hands for a long time before rising to find the recorder. The house listened. And outside, the wind moved through the trees as if stirring everything that had once been silent.